Yes, sir.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anthony Pereira. I'm the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. I'm happy to welcome everyone today to our webinar on Trump 2.0, Policies, Practices, and Prospects for Caribbean Engagement. I'm very happy to be doing this webinar with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. We've had a partnership with the CPC this is the third year of my directorship, but the partnership goes back before my time when former President of Costa Rica, Luis Guillermo Solis, was director of LACC, and probably long before that. What I'd like to do is just pose the issue. We are now, believe it or not, we are now in day 95 of the Trump 2.0 administration. It feels somewhat longer because of the sort of radical overturning of many of the basic infrastructure of the world order. We have sort of very interesting echoes of previous administrations, but not recent administrations. I would say the administrations of McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft are often evoked to understand the current period. But this presents a tremendous challenge for the state managers in other countries, people in civil society around the world, and obviously in the Caribbean as well, amongst other regions. So we have a wonderful panel here to analyze this moment, to sort of understand what's happened in these first 95 days, but also what the prospects are in terms of the relationship between the Caribbean and the Trump administration. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, Professor Ivalaw Lloyd-Griffith, who is a fellow with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. And he has published widely on Caribbean issues, various books. He presented his book, Challenged Sovereignty, The Impact of Drugs, Crime, Terrorism, and Cyber Threats in the Caribbean at FIU last year. He has a new book on Guyana and the oil sector. He has a BA in social sciences from the University of Guyana, a PhD in political science from the City University of New York Graduate School. And last but not least, and I'm not doing justice to his very rich curriculum, he was Dean of the Honors College at FIU. And for that reason, he's always welcome to come back to FIU. So I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Ivalaw Lloyd-Griffith, to say a bit more about the webinar and the participants in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tony. And let me join Dr. Pereira in welcoming you all to this educational engagement between FIU, LACC, and the Caribbean Policy Consortium. You know, the events of the last couple of months, almost a year, have led me, and I'm sure I'm not the only person, to reflect on words of wisdom by policymakers across time and by scholars across time. And one of the people who I've been reflecting on significantly in the last few months is a gentleman considered one of the founders of modern philosophy, a Frenchman called René Descartes. Now, Descartes is probably mostly known because of his proposition that cogito ergo sum. But I want to recommend that there is something else that Descartes said that is relevant to the times in which we find himself. He said the following. He said, to know what people really think, don't pay regard only to what they say, pay regard to what they do. And if you think of what Tony Pereira mentioned, we're approaching almost 100 days of the new Trump administration. I think it's an appropriate time to reflect on the sayings and doings of the Trump administration in regard to foreign policy. Foreign policy, apropos a region that is dear to most of us, if not all of us, in this webinar. And I'd like to therefore enable us to have a conversation about the sayings and doings of foreign policy in relation to the Caribbean by enabling the conversation to be led by a very distinguished set of colleagues and friends who I'll take the opportunity now to introduce briefly. let me say this, each of these colleagues has a resume that will take the entire webinar. So I'll just use my introductory moment to give a couple of bullets about each of them, starting with Dr. Frank Mora. Frank is professor of politics and international relations and a senior researcher at the Jack Gordon Institute. He's also a former director of LACC at FIU. Before returning to FIU in January of this year, Frank served as U.S. ambassador to the OAS, the National Summit of the Americas coordinator. Before that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere. Frank has also taught at places across the nation, including the National War College and Rhodes College. As you would expect, Frank has been prolific over the years, publishing 4 books and dozens of academic and policy articles, written many chapters and monographs on U.S., Latin American affairs, hemispheric security, civil-military relations, Cuban politics, and military and Latin American foreign policy. After Frank will have spoken, we'll be hearing from Andy Knight. Andy is Distinguished Professor of Political Science and a Provost Fellow for Black Excellence and Leadership at the University of Alberta. He also formerly chaired the Department of Political Science at that distinguished university. But Andy has also been in the Caribbean, not only of the Caribbean, for he directed the Institute of International Relations at the UWI for a number of years and made a mark in several respects, among other things, establishing the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean, which he directed for several years, and founding a journal at that academy. Andy has served as editor-in-chief of the African Security Journal and of the International Journal, and he's the founder of the journal while he was at the Diplomatic Academy, a journal called Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy. Andy has the distinction of being a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, was awarded the honorary doctorate from McMaster University last year, and also has the distinction of being one of the 2024 top 25 Canadian immigrant awardees. We'll hear from Dr. Knight afterwards. And then we'll hear from Elizabeth Riley, first female executive director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, appointed in 2021 July. But Liz has a long, distinguished career of more than 2 decades in disaster risk management at the regional and international levels and in environmental management. She has played a leadership role in the coordination of regional responses to all major hazards impacting the Caribbean, from Hurricane Ivan in 2004 to Hurricane Beryl in 2024. Liz also was a key health sector lead in the region's coordination of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Liz holds a master's in environment and development from the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. Her bachelor's is in geography from UWI, and she holds a master's certificate in results-based monitoring and evaluation and information systems from the University of Laval in Quebec. So I think we're in for intellectual and policy treat in hearing the initial set of remarks from the distinguished colleagues who I had the honor of just introducing. I'll turn first to Dr. Mora, and we'll invite Dr. Mora to take the lead in enabling us in 12 to 15 minutes to have the basis for a substantive conversation subsequently. So over to you, Frank.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Griffith, and for the introduction. It's an honor to be with all of you. I very much look forward to the back and forth of the discussion that we will have among each other and with those who are listening in. Well, I find myself currently living in Washington, D.C., and having been in government until recently, I thought that the best contribution that I can make is to give a view from Washington and try to, as best as I can, try to interpret from inside the government, although I don't not find myself in government anymore, but certainly talk to a lot of people in government, and I have a sort of perhaps a unique understanding of what's going on within, beyond what we're seeing on the outside. I think that the first place to start is when we think about the administration and the Caribbean, and my focus will be on the Caribbean, is that if you think of a Venn diagram, usually when you think of US Caribbean or US Latin America relations, usually you think in terms of interests and objectives of each party. What are the interests or objectives? And usually, if you think of a Venn diagram, a lot of those interests converge, they see things similarly, and in other issues, they don't. They are separate or different issues. My assessment is that there is no Venn diagram, that there, at the moment, the circles do not meet. Because from Washington, from the administration, as best as we can discern, there are three fundamental objectives or interests in the Caribbean and in the Western Hemisphere, I should say, as well. First and foremost, of course, is the issue of migration. And we are all familiar, I'm not going to go into that other than to perhaps say a couple of things at the end. That is the overwhelming priority of the administration. An administration that is very, as we know, very transactional, views the world in very zero-sum terms. And so that is the issue that they see, is how they can deport as many immigrants in the United States, documented or undocumented, back to the countries of origin or any country that will accept them. The second and more secondarily issue or objective or interest of the United States is the issue of China in the Western Hemisphere, how to mitigate, how to push back on Chinese influence, particularly in the economic space. And the third issue is combating, confronting transnational criminal organizations, but particularly in Mexico and Central America. And we've heard a lot about the Tren de Aragua, but I think the focus is very much on those organizations that create violence close to the U.S. So those are the three issues, and almost exclusively. But the most important is migration. Okay, so what are the issues for the Caribbean? Well, of course, those issues have nothing to do with what interests Washington. Those issues are climate change and climate finance. That is a priority for many Caribbean countries, if not all Caribbean countries. That is simply not an issue in Washington. And in fact, if you look at the reorganization of the State Department, they have either de-emphasized or eliminated any bureau or office working on the issue of climate change or climate finance. Second, I think, is the issue of energy and energy transition. There, I also don't see much of a convergence. Let's set aside Secretary Rubio's visit to Guyana for a second, where the issue was, or one of the issues was energy. But for the most part, the United States is not interested in the issue of energy beyond Guyana and perhaps Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll get back to that. I think the third issue that the Caribbean is very interested in, of course, is issues of development. I certainly remember as a U.S. ambassador to the OAS that this issue among the 14 countries of CARICOM was sort of almost central, in addition to climate, central to their objectives and their interests. And there, of course, with everything that has gone with USA, not that the Caribbean was a large recipient of foreign assistance, it was not, but certainly when it comes to issues, broader issues of development that remain a priority for the Caribbean, that is just simply not in the cards for the United States. So I don't want to go on, but I hope you see that there is very little convergence and there is quite a bit of divergence on the issues of importance for both the Caribbean and the United States. If you look at the reorganization of the State Department and of foreign assistance that was just recently announced by Secretary Rubio, the document was leaked, but then it was more formally released by the administration. If you look beyond, and I've spoken to a number of people in the department about what this means, particularly for the Western Hemisphere, you will see or notice that there has been a kind of not elimination, but a further weakening of the role or the office that handles or manages Caribbean affairs. Okay. It was still within the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. That has not changed. But clearly, these issues that are important to the Caribbean and that the Caribbean want to talk about are simply not even on the agenda within the State Department. And within those that are that would be of interest. Again, I'm not saying that these things have been eliminated. No, that's not true. The office and the Director for Caribbean Affairs is still very much there, but you have seen a further weakening of that office. And I suspect, and here now I am speculating, there's going to be a further, I think, weakening or discarding of Caribbean because they don't fit within the administration's priorities in the region. Now, the challenge, not just for the Caribbean, but for the world, is, of course, the uncertainty, the unpredictability, the capriciousness of policy in Washington. Decision-making in Washington, regardless of administrations, there's always been a decision-making process structure, an interagency process for dealing with a host of issues. Every administration is a little different. The structure is a little different. The number of meetings changes over time. But what we're seeing today is that there's no structure. There is no decision as of today, right? 100 days in, could change in a month. But as of today, there is no decision-making process. Decision-making, there is no, for example, there's now coming in a senior director for Western Hemisphere and the affairs in the White House, who is someone, as I believe, though, is not familiar with the region, has never worked on the region, both the Caribbean or Latin America. So you see that when that happens, decision-making gets very difficult. Decisions are simply not made. And so it's very difficult, and I think the Caribbean has started to understand that they don't know who the interlocutor really is in Washington. Is it the special envoy for Latin America, Mauricio Claver Colón? Some people say yes. Is it the assistant or the senior bureau official in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs? Is it the senior director? It's not clear who is running the show, although certainly there are individuals who have the responsibility of making decisions and try to do so. But it is difficult, it has been difficult to find who exactly is handling many of these issues. And so one could suspect that in a world where the level of disruption, right, one could say the collapse of the international system as we know it for the last 80 or so years, and that is now in crisis, has repercussions, obviously, for our policy in the Caribbean. Caribbean will not be spared from this uncertainty. I think the challenge for the Caribbean is how, which has always been the case, but let's be honest, is how does the Caribbean stay within the radar of Washington? And I think that's going to be less so the case, because as of the divergence of interests and objectives that I find, right? You heard the president in the Oval Office early say in reference to Latin America, and I suspect I can sort of extend that to the Caribbean, is we don't need Latin America. Right? We're not, there's nothing there that we need. And so I think that kind of distancing, that kind of, it's not benign neglect, really, as it's been referred to in the past, but it's more simply of, if you are in the circle of interest of the United States, we have something to talk to you about. Otherwise, you will not receive much of our attention, particularly when you see the uncertainty and the collapse of both the foreign affairs system, the bureaucracy. People are anxious. People are not willing to make decisions, rear their head for fear of being slapped down. Now, in the area of, and I'll try to finish here, and it is difficult in such an uncertain, unpredictable, anxious moment to sort of look into the future and decide, where is this really going? There is the important, I think, trip that Secretary Rubio took to the Caribbean, in particular Jamaica, Suriname, and Guyana. And there were, discussions there in terms of the Secretary's priorities with respect to Cuban medical doctors, for example. But there was a discussion certainly on the issue of energy and oil in Guyana. And I think that is an area where I think there's going to be much more convergence or discussion or engagement with Guyana, and particularly with respect to the off and on threats emanating from Guyana's neighbor, Venezuela, regarding Essequibo, and of course the energy and minerals and other resources that are available there, and whether that could create conflict. The administration has seemed to say to the Venezuelans, that's, sort of drawn a red line there. And I think Rubio made that very clear during his trip to Guyana. Some people ask, well, why did Secretary Rubio, may have been one of his early trips, decide to go to the Caribbean, his second trip to the Western Hemisphere? Does this indicate an interest and engagement with the Caribbean? And I'll finish with this. I think that what matters, and you sort of indicated this in your intro, what matters is not how many times a Secretary of State or president, regardless, visits the region. They can visit the region 3-4 times a year. What matters is, what's the substance of that conversation? Is it one in which the United States goes down to intimidate, to make transactional deals that would only benefit one party? Or is it about cooperation, finding ways of collaborating on a whole host of issues of interest to the United States and to the Caribbean? It's more the quality and the substance of the visit than how many times that leaders visit the region that determines the very nature of the relationship. So Dr. Griffith, I'll leave it at that. I think I took about 13 minutes of our time. I very much look forward to the other presentations and to the discussions that we'll have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frank. As Frank was speaking, I was reminded of the words of wisdom by another gentleman, this time a statesman, a gentleman called Anthony Eden. Served for a long time as Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, but also served as Prime Minister. Actually, he succeeded Winston Churchill. And in a speech in the 1950s, it was regarding Europe, he said something which I think is relevant to this conversation. Here is what Anthony Eden said. If I can only find my notes about Anthony Eden. said there is nothing more dangerous than a foreign policy based on unreality. I think what Frank Mora was sharing with us is some reality elements insofar as United States disposition to the Caribbean is concerned. He was helping us to get a reality check. And as he was talking, I was thinking of the words of Sir Anthony Eden. So let's move on from Frank to Andy. And the floor is now yours, Andy.
Thank you very much, Abdul, and thank you very much to the other panelists who are here with me today and the organizers of this wonderful panel. I think, the opening statements made earlier that we are gathered at the time of considerable uncertainty is where I want to start. I think what I've described in my own work as a global interregnum really reflects on this uncertainty moment in history. This is not merely a transitional phase between dominant powers or political parties, but a deep structural rupture in the very architecture of global order. Interregnums are usually that space between one world order and the next. And I think what we are witnessing right now is that kind of deep structural rupture in the architecture of the 1945 world order. And the re-election of Donald Trump, so the Trump 2.0, to the presidency of the United States is not the cause of this rupture, but it certainly is an accelerant. His America First ethos, steeped in transnationalism, steeped in ultranationalism, steeped in isolationism, I think serves as both a symptom and a catalyst of what I call the New World disorder. And let's be clear, the post-1945 world order, imperfect as it was anchored on a set of multilateral institutions, normative frameworks, cooperative mechanisms designed to prevent another great power war. It was supposed to help promote human rights, advance global development, and deal with the problems of the day as they came up. This order rested on four critical pillars. The first is the commitment to multilateral diplomacy, embodied in such institutions as the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions. The second is a rules-based trading system underpinned by agreements through the GATT, as it was called before, and later the World Trade Organization. The third is security alliances and deterrence mechanisms, led primarily by NATO and the victors, I guess, of World War II and US security umbrella. And the fourth is a liberal international ethos that advocated for democracy, for human rights, and cooperative problem solving. Now, what Trump 2.0 has done so far in less than 100 days is to really wage war on all four of those pillars. First, we are witnessing the deliberate erosion of multilateral institutions. The Trump administration in its first term undermined the United Nations system, withdrew from key agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, and actively challenged the World Health Organization during the pandemic, as you remember. In his second term, we can expect even more aggressive disengagement from the multilateral system, not just withdrawals, but active sabotage of multilateral norms like democracy, multilateral cooperation, human rights protection, and so on. Now, secondly, Trump's disdain for global trade regimes jeopardizes the very stability of the international commerce. And we can see this with this so-called tariff wars. His renewed threat of tariffs and trade wars, particularly targeting China and even traditional allies like Canada and the European Union. I think risk further fragmenting global supply chains for the Caribbean nations in particular that are dependent on predictable trade flows, dependent on tourism and remittances. This is not just an abstraction. It is a direct threat to the livelihoods of people living in our region of the Caribbean. Third, Trump's erratic approach to security alliances creates a vacuum in global power balances. If NATO falters or the US withdraws from longstanding security commitments, be it in the Caribbean or in Ukraine, we may see heightened aggression from revisionist powers and a weakened deterrence system. This instability opens up, I think, dangerous space for new forms of coercion, including cyber warfare, economic blackmail, disinformation campaigns, etc., especially in fragile or small states. And finally, perhaps most troublingly, Trump's populist Christian ultra-nationalism signals a retreat from the values that undergirded post-war liberal internationalism. Human rights, refugee protection, democratic norms, these are all under siege at the moment. The ideological space, once filled by cooperative governance, is now dominated, as I think Dr. Moore put it, by zero-sum thinking, transactional diplomacy, and I would add xenophobic politics. For the Caribbean, this is a pivotal moment. Caribbean states are small states trying to navigate big storms, and I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about that from Elizabeth Riley. But our development aspirations in the Caribbean, climate resilience efforts, regional integration efforts and projects depend on a stable, cooperative, multilateral order. Trump 2.0 represents the antithesis of that order. He is not merely reshaping US foreign policy, he is basically accelerating the collapse of normative scaffolding that made global governance possible. And in this new disorder, Caribbean states must not retreat. Instead, I think we have to engage with greater clarity, with greater unity, and greater purpose. I've noticed that whenever people stand up to Trump, he tends to back down. In many cases, we see this in the case of Canada and our Prime Minister Mark Carney. We see this in the case of China and the way in which he has had to sort of back away from some of the more aggressive language used against the Chinese government. We must harness our collective voice in global fora, even although we are small individual states. We must reinforce the importance of multilateralism and reimagine diplomacy to better assert our agency. The interregnum, as I call it, in this interregnum, we are experiencing both a crisis as well as an opportunity. I think a crisis of legitimacy for the old order, but also an opportunity to shape the contours of the new order, whatever comes next. And we are not quite there yet, but we want to be able to be at the table, small nation states, having a place at the table to help to shape the contours of what comes next. The Caribbean cannot afford to be a passive observer because so much is at stake for these small states. It is an existential crisis for Caribbean states. We must become architects of a more just and inclusive and sustainable global future. I think I'll end it there. I think there's going to be lots of room for discussion and debate about the impact of Trump 2.0 on the Caribbean. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much, Andy. Now, while you were speaking, Andy, I was remembering something I wrote down regarding words from another gentleman, this time an American former president. The gentleman to whom I refer is John F. Kennedy. Let me share with you some words that I find apropos the moment in the conversation from John F. Kennedy. He said this: "The purpose of foreign policy is not to provide an outlet for our own sentiments of hope or indignation. It is to shape real events in a real world." What we're talking about is real events, real projects, real platitudes, real policies, apropos a part of the world that we hold dear. And now, to wrap up this initial part of our conversation, I want to invite Liz Riley to talk about whatever she wants to talk about. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you so much, Prof. And I want to say thanks also for giving me the opportunity to say a little bit from SEDIMA's perspective on what is happening on the disaster risk management side in Trump 2.0. And to do so, I'm just going to cover three things to say a little bit about my organization, because this sets the context for why the interactions with the US government and the changes are so important, to zero in on some of the areas that have specifically impacted us. And I say some because the changes have been so wide-ranging that some of the implications are direct, some are indirect, but I've just pulled out some to highlight, and then some of the considerations going forward. So SEDIMA covers 20 Caribbean states. We are part of the Caribbean community, and that is an important point because of the political voice that CARICOM has. So matters that impact in the area of disaster risk management are discussed with and also represented by our political leadership and by the foreign policy positions of individual CARICOM states and also CARICOM as a collective where that is appropriate. So within the 20 states, though, there is some diversity with respect to the relationships with the government of the United States. We have 14 independent states, all of which are beneficiaries or have been beneficiaries at some point or in some way from initiatives by the government of the United States which support their disaster risk management work. And the other 6 states are 5 of them UK overseas territories, and 1 of them is a Dutch overseas territory, Dutch St. Martin, which means that it does not benefit, not in a direct way, from development aid from the government of the United States. But I'll explain a little bit more about why the SEDIMA system, which views the 20 states as a collective, is also impacted more broadly by the US government changes through specific partnerships. So SEDIMA has a remit, which is here on the screen. We bring together the 20 states, making representation in international fora and also within the CARICOM space, coordinating support for states that have been impacted. But more importantly, we spend a lot of our time on building resilience to the hazards that face us. And these hazards are multiple. You will see them displayed here on the screen. And so it's not only climate change, which I will speak to a little bit more in the next couple of slides, but it's also other types of hazards which are frequently occurring in the region. We're very seismically active. We had a big volcanic eruption in St. Vincent and the Grenadines just in 2021. Last year, we had a large chemical spill offshore Tobago, and we also have health-related hazards, as you saw with COVID-19. And so we have the full gamut. In fact, we're considered to be the second most vulnerable region to hazard impacts in the world. And with respect to the climate, this is particularly important. And I really enjoyed Frank's contribution. I think he was really bang on in terms of the priority areas for the Caribbean, because climate change is one, because it has to be. And even if we look at just that last year, one of the things that we have noted is that the hazards continue to change in the Caribbean, and the implications are getting much more severe. So last year we had Beryl at the beginning of July, developed into a Category 5 storm, earliest one on record to do so. And this is just a symptom of things to come. We also had last year in May, extensive wildfires in Belize for the first time, very extensive for the first time. And not only was agricultural land destroyed, but we also had significant destruction of forest reserves in Belize, and first time at that scale. And so you see what is coming towards us, things that traditionally we've not been grappling with, and we're going to see more of it. The last one I'll mention is the matter of the excess heat. And so for those of us living in the Caribbean, yes, we're accustomed to heat, but in recent years, we've been seeing excess heat warnings happening across the Caribbean space, and the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology has advised us that, in fact, this is going to become much more prevalent. So traditional hazards, but also new hazards occurring as well. And the reason that I spent a little time explaining this is because when we're discussing disaster risk management, we're talking about a developmental issue. Climate change is an existential issue, and we're also talking about a security issue for Caribbean states. So let's pivot then to looking at some of the shifts that took place since January, and then we'll talk about the implications. So I concur both with Frank and Andy that a cloud of uncertainty is really what is over us in our discipline. So I've set up a little bit of a timeline here to explain what we've seen so far, the critical ones, not all. So the executive order of January 2025 on the 20th with the intent to withdraw from the Paris Accords is a serious issue for us because climate change is a priority. On the 24th of January, we saw the stop work order, which was related to the work of USAID. That had some direct implications and indirect implications for us, which I'll explain on future slides. We also have a very deep collaboration with the World Food Program, and you will note that the stop order, even though the World Food Program was initially not covered in the January 24 stop orders, the instructions coming out over the 6th to the 7th of February did stop the humanitarian assistance work of the World Food Program, and a significant part of their global budget, approximately 50% or so, is actually funded by USAID. And there's a big program in the Caribbean, so that had knock-on implications. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But at that same time, we also saw a restriction of international interactions by a number of the US technical institutions. And we have very deep integration between our technical institutions in the Caribbean with US technical institutions. The 27th of February and continuing into March were the layoffs and staff cuts at NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which is one of the technical institutions with which we work very closely, and also the institution which has the National Hurricane Center, which is run by them, has a designated responsibility under the World Meteorological Organization as it relates to hurricanes for the Atlantic Basin. And on the 18th of March, SEDEMA received a formal correspondence that following the stop orders of January 24th on USAID programs in the Caribbean, that the Regional Disaster Assistance Program was one of those programs that had an instruction to be canceled. So what then were the implications of this? Now, at the national level, we did a quick survey of the SEDEMA states. 8 of those with funded programs responded. At that time, the indications were that just under $1 million in value of current or pipeline support to operational readiness programs, which of course are important for getting ready for the hurricane season, those finances were no longer available. And these include capacity strengthening, training in countries in critical areas like shelter management, damage assessment, etc. The U.S. Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs did a lot of work in that area and worked collaboratively with SEDIMA in that area. So many of the states have had to pivot to alternate financing. We, of course, alerted our participating states about the potential implications and advising them also to look at making shifts nationally with respect to their own budgets, but also to look at partners who can support in bridging that financing gap. Now, at the regional level, the exposure was in two areas. One was on the financial risk exposure and the other on the technical and scientific side. So on the financial side, we had done a survey of some of the key institutions that provide services to SEDIMA. You'll see them listed there. The Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology is bullet 2. Bullet 3 is the Caribbean Public Health Agency, which supports on the health hazard side. University of the West Indies Seismic Research Center, self-explanatory for earthquakes, volcanoes, also support on tsunami. The Regional Security System and CARICOM Impacts, which is the implementation agency for crime and security. And the security very much complements humanitarian action in the Caribbean, which is why this is discussed here. And of course, we also see disaster risk management as a security issue, which I had mentioned earlier. So approximately $10 million in value being disrupted or lost was the initial estimate. I understand that there are some upward revisions of that as institutions have received a deeper insight into what has happened. Now, on the scientific and technical exposure side, we've seen disruption in the flow of information, which informs our ability to ready and alert our populations with respect to potential hazard impacts related to CARFA's relationship with the Center for Diseases Control and some critical alerting information, which then was no longer coming forth to the region. Similarly, with the seismic and volcanic hazards, some of the adjustments that have impacted the Pacific Tsunami Center, the U.S. Geological Survey, had implications for the work of the Seismic Research Center. And then on the Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, which of course, as you understandably receives a lot of attention because we have a coming hurricane season, there were some disruptions with respect to access to certain types of technical information, forecast, predicting, modeling information, as well as there was for a long time a discussion around what would happen with respect to the National Hurricane Center's responsibilities under WMO in providing forecasting services, including Hurricane Hunter services for the Caribbean. Now, just about two and a half weeks ago or so, there was a meeting of the our Region 4 under the World Meteorological Organization, and NOAA did attend. And there was a meeting between the Caribbean counterparts and NOAA. And at the technical level, what we have understood is that from a technical perspective, NOAA has intent through the Hurricane Center to continue to provide those services to the Caribbean. But I think in an atmosphere of uncertainty, it's important that we continue to monitor this, since this is very important for the Caribbean. So with all of these disruptions, understandably, institutions have been pivoting and exploring options. Now, with respect to SEDIMA, I mentioned that some of the partnerships that we have extend beyond the independent states. So through the World Food Program, the support on the logistics, particularly as it relates to supporting relief management in the aftermath of hazard events, that has been disrupted in terms of the financial flows to the World Food Program. And in fact, I'm scheduled to have a meeting with them this week to get a better understanding as to what has happened subsequent to the stop orders with respect to their humanitarian actions and what resources are actually going to be available for 2025. I'm actually scheduled to have that meeting tomorrow afternoon. So we'll get some better insight on that. But there is some risk that the financial resources are certainly not at the levels that they were before. And just to give you an example, when we responded to Hurricane Beryl from the CDEMA side, and this didn't include the big costs for logistics, which were covered by World Food Program, it was about between 350 to 400,000 US dollars was the cost of our own deployment support to the state. So response is not a cheap proposition. So what are some of the actions that we've been taking? So we did the online survey to get a better handle on what was happening with the countries. We had a meeting of the regional institutions that work with CDEMA and provide services to CDEMA in February, early February. And we also met with a number of our key development and technical partners. And this is important because we work through partnerships. Nothing is done by any one entity in the Caribbean because we're small. So we have to work together to deliver the results that we want. But what we found from that 14th of February meeting is that almost all of our traditional partners, including through the UN, Red Cross, have been impacted because, as you know, development financing is multi-layered. So some institutions will get direct funding out of USAID or the Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs, whereas others may get second or third tier funding through other institutions. And they've all been impacted principally on the readiness actions and ability to be able to respond. And many are still trying to understand exactly what those implications will be and how will it, in practical terms, affect their ability to support the coordinated response efforts that we have in the Caribbean. We did make representation at the heads of government meeting, which took place here in Barbados. We met with the heads on the 21st of February, and I presented a paper to discuss the implications and to make recommendations on how we would move forward. And since then, and through into April, we've been working with a diversity of partners, looking at alternate pivots for access to forecast and prediction information, principally around the hydrometeorological hazards, but also on the health side, and also for alternate financial support for effecting response. So what are some of those considerations I think that we have to look at? And many of them are in alignment with the points raised by Frank and Andy. So the reality is that because we're small and we have limited resources, there's always been high risk exposure on our disaster risk management front, whether we're looking at resilience building or if we're looking at response, which is a component of the broader resilience, but the one that tends to get more attention. So even as we do short-term pivots to other external entities to assist us on the financial and the scientific and technological side, the fact is that it still is going to compound our risk exposure because a lot of those resources are just not in the Caribbean, even though we've been trying to develop them over time. But nonetheless, we still have to interrogate and secure support through those short-term pivots. The second is with respect to how at the national level it's being handled. And as I indicated, it's been signaled at the highest political level, the risks and what we need to deal with here. Countries are reassessing their national budgets. We've also indicated there's a need to provide additional resources to CDEMA. We've been engaging with the heads of government and, of course, understandably, with the current chair of CARICOM, which is the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Amor Motley, on generating support for the efforts of CDEMA to make sure that we are still ready. And so there's been a lot of lobbying happening in various spaces with traditional as well as non-traditional partners in trying to build new alliances or to deepen existing alliances with friendly entities across the globe can support us on the financial, but also the scientific and technical side. Many of these are still being worked through. We also feel, and we have been carefully observing the domino effect that is happening as a result of the US government actions and also other geopolitical realities across the globe, including the war in Ukraine. So we've seen a pivot from the UK, for example, with an already announced cut in their own support for development financing from 0.5 to 0.3% of GNP by 2027, that has had a knock-on effect in terms of a financial arrangement we had with them for supporting our ability to do response as well. This is being discussed, but as I said, we're also looking at alternates. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So it really means that as a region, with the support of our political leadership, the outlook of the Caribbean has to continue to be one of finding new partners, non-traditional partners, and also we're exploring engagements with the private sector to meet some of these gaps. So broader implications, of course, for small island developing states, just by virtue of what is happening on the global front with climate change. We know that the US government is an important contributor to both the Green Climate Fund. There are also discussions around the Loss and Damage Fund. I've been reading and understand that they've also stepped away from being on the board of the Loss and Damage Fund. So that's a very clear indication with respect to the policy position on the matters of climate finance, which were raised by Frank in his presentation. I also want to just touch on that issue of the migration, deportation, that posture that has been taken. So there's been a lot of conversation around Haiti. We already know Haiti is in a difficult situation in terms of stability in our absence thereof in country. It is one of our SEDIMA states and a member of CARICOM. So we are watching this situation carefully because any movements towards mass deportations into Haiti, especially given the current situation, will potentially exacerbate what may need to be dealt with in that country during the hurricane season for sure. And we also know that they're very seismically vulnerable as well. So all of these are things that we're monitoring from the SEDIMA side. And then last, I very much agree with Andy's point on opportunities that we can draw on. And we have been discussing really an opportunity for a long-term strategic vision for the Caribbean region, the importance of sort of repositioning the region. I agree with Andy that absolutely we cannot back down. We in the Caribbean, we are survivors and we are thrivers because we have always been able to make positive out of difficult situations. And I see this as no different. I see partnerships as being a very important part of this, non-traditional partnerships, but also deepening partnerships with long-standing partners and maybe changing the nature of those partnerships as well. I concur that regional cohesion is absolutely critical. We have to stand together in terms of the foreign policy outlook of CARICOM as a region, certainly on this issue. And I am not a specialist on other areas, but just in looking at the whole conversations around the trade, understanding the supply chain implications for us, which also have a knock-on effect with respect to disaster risk management and ability to provide relief for states that have been impacted, that we've been keeping an eye on. So the regional cohesion on our policy position is going to be absolutely necessary. And I also think a deeper pivot towards self-reliance in terms of developing certain types of capability within the Caribbean to the extent that we're able to do so. So I'll stop there, and I'm really happy to engage in the discussions and to address any questions which come forward. Thank you.
Great. Another excellent presentation, this time by our colleague Liz Riley. Let me make one observation before I initiate the conversation, the question and answer round of our engagement. Liz's presentation allows me to put a plug for a forthcoming book that I have on Guyana, oil and climate change. But I use the opportunity in the first chapter of that book to paint a portrait of the climate change reality globally. And part of that is to focus on how does the reality at the global level challenge the region. And there's a part where I talk about some of the very issues that Liz talked about. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind, there's Calypso in the Caribbean going back 2-3 decades, talked about all the bones connected. Even if you're not a political scientist or an economist, to see the connectivity of the world, interdependence, global interdependence. We know, as the Calypso said, the head bone connected to the neck bone connected to the shoulder bone. So there's a connectivity of all the bones of the global order. And some of those bones are manifesting themselves in very challenging ways for small subordinate states, including states in the Caribbean. I want to begin the round of questions and answers by asking each of the panelists to reflect on an element that was raised in the conversation by several colleagues. First by Frank Mora. And that is the C word that is a central part of the push by the United States, China. Would love to hear a little bit more about how might Caribbean countries, in this, as Andy says, interregnum, maneuver in dealing with the realities and the necessities of the American antagonism towards China, but the reality that in many Caribbean countries, there's a necessity to engage with China. Would love to hear, beginning with Frank and then Andy and then Liz, what are some of the dynamics of the China-Caribbean engagement that we need to be thinking about? Frank?
Thank you, Willa. So, this is certainly the case with Caribbean as well as many countries around the world. My first suggestion or recommendation is don't call attention to yourself. Try to maintain a low profile. Does it mean that Caribbean should disconnect itself from China? And I don't think that, frankly, the United States or the Trump administration is paying too much attention to what China is doing in the Caribbean yet. But I think there is, as far as I see, there is no need to think about how Caribbean can get out of what it might perceive as a delicate, challenging situation if the United States put pressures on them to disconnect or to distance themselves from China. The Caribbean, let's be frank, is simply not that important to Washington at the moment. But if the Caribbean wishes, or any Caribbean wishes to highlight, to emphasize, to augment its relationship or some project or anything with China, that would be calling attention, and that is not what you want at the moment. Back to you, Willow.
Words of wisdom, Frank. Andy?
But I'm going to have a slight disagreement with Frank on this one, because I don't think that the Caribbean can avoid any sort of attempt at engaging with China and making it public, because it's already started to happen. The Belt and Road Initiative is now in the Caribbean too. China has been engaged with the Caribbean. I remember back in 2014 when I was in the Caribbean, the first visit of Xi Jinping outside of China was to Trinidad and Tobago. I was like a fly on the wall, because I was helping the Prime Minister at the time with her speeches for that meeting. And we noted that Joe Biden was sent to Trinidad and Tobago the week before Xi Jinping's visit to assure the Caribbean states leaders that the US was still interested in what was going on in the Caribbean. So there was a real sort of playing out of the geopolitical conflict between China and the United States in that region, which are considered to be one of the most globalized regions of the world. The Caribbean is. Every single major power is there in the Caribbean still. if you think about it. There are already infrastructure projects by China, heavily invested in infrastructure projects in the Caribbean. Look at the North-South Highway in Jamaica, for example, which has enhanced connectivity and support for economic development in that country. Think about the trade and investment that's already started to happen between China and CARICOM, facilitating tracking of investments and trade between China and Caribbean nations, and highlighting a focus on targeted sector-specific investments. Think about the sector focus. China is really increasing targeting sectors like agriculture, technology, renewable energy, telecommunications, fintech, moving beyond previously considered previously broad spectrum investments to more innovative driven projects in the Caribbean. And think about the diplomatic relations that have already been established in the Caribbean. China has a motive behind all of this. And one is to sort of get Caribbean states who normally have supported Taiwan to shift their allegiance from Taiwan to mainland China. China's diplomacy in the region is quite open. I think if the Americans don't see it, they're completely blind. This effort to persuade Caribbean nations to recognize the People's Republic of China over Taiwan, to strengthen ties with countries like Grenada that have now reaffirmed their commitment to the One China policy, to try to get countries like St. Vincent to shift away from Taiwan to China. It already has Barbados, Trinidad. I was there for the opening of the first embassy in Beijing by Trinidad and Tobago. It already has a number of Caribbean states in their pocket. So there's a real tension in the geopolitical situation in the Caribbean already. So I think is, we are not going to be able to somehow hide our engagement with China. It's already happening. And I think that's one of the challenges the Caribbean states have. I agree with Frank on that point that, it'd be nice if we can keep our heads down and not be noticed. But the reality is we're already in the midst of this engagement with China, and I don't think we can get out of that. It's just part of the slippage of the United States as a hegemonic power in the globe, and the rise of China. Not that China is going to be the next hegemonic power, but China has risen to the point where it can actually challenge the United States in its own backyard, and I think is not afraid to make that point. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Andy. Liz?
So I concur with Andy. And so as a matter of fact, not only does China have a large diplomatic footprint, and I remember maybe, I don't know if it was about 10 years ago, Andy might be able to assist me with the timing, but there was a proliferation of opening of Chinese embassies across the CARICOM space in 1 year. And I distinctly remember it. And the reality is that, there are fiscal challenges in the Caribbean, and support for development financing has always been a challenge for our states. And we build relationships in spaces which are mutually beneficial. And that's why you see what Andy has described in terms of the level of Chinese investment. As a matter of fact, SEDIMA also signed a new project with China just last year or towards the end of 23, which is supported disaster risk management, which is the first project that we've actually had with the government of China. So the interest is there, and the reality is also that there's more space now that has been created by the actions by the US government. When you have a situation where, on one day you're running programs supported by USAID and the Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs, and the next day it is gone. So where there is a space, nature does not like a void, and it is going to be filled in some way. So I think the relationships are there, and it's really also a matter of the posture that the government of China will take in terms of does it intend to become more aggressive or assertive, I should say, in the Caribbean space? But I don't think it is something that the dial can't be turned back on this one. As the Caribbean people would say, the horse is already bolted.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you, Liz. Before I read the next question, which is a question directed to Frank, let me make one quick comment on the conversation we have with regard to China and presence and the geopolitical dynamics, China, United States. Putting a plug again for the book that I talked about that's forthcoming. Part of the analysis in this book relates to not only both United States and China investment in Guyana's energy sector. You know, very often people talk about ExxonMobil in Guyana, forgetting that ExxonMobil is only one part of the consortium. An important part of that consortium is the China National Offshore Oil Company. But there's part of Guyana's project which is to build a natural gas plant. The competition for the funding for that natural gas plant, it's called the gas to energy project. The competition for that funding for the gas to energy project allowed one to see some of the geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States. $562 million US provided by the United States Export-Import Bank. And I want to read you the legislation under which that funding is authorized. The legislation relates to the US competition with China, where the United States looks to see what competitive advantage China may have with regard to certain targeted strategic areas. And that gas energy project was one that was considered to be a strategic advantage. And not only did United States Import-Export Bank provide funding, in January of this year, the chairman and president of the Import-Export Bank, Rita Jo Lewis, went to Georgetown 3 days to make the point that this is a strategic interest of the United States in regard to the competition with China, and that we will be continuing to provide. So I agree with you, Frank, that you've got to keep your head down as much as possible. But the head's already there. And the competition, what may be unfortunate is that so many folks in the region don't appreciate the extent to which the competition is geopolitically directed. So look for more, and Frank, you're quite right. The frequency of the visits may not mean much if you don't focus on the substance and the intent of the outcome of the visits. But I can anticipate more visits by not only American State Department officials, but other officials to Guyana and Suriname, because China is positioning itself in Suriname as well. Right now, a bridge is being built over Guyana's mighty Demerara River. Who's funding the bridge? Who's building that bridge? China. Bridge should be built between Suriname and Guyana. Who's going to build that bridge? China. So I think you're likely to see not only the engagement stepping up, but because of the disposition of the American administration now, you're going to have a little more pushing and shoving involving Guyana, Caribbean, and United States and China. Let me read a question. Thank you, a colleague of ours, Bruce Zagaris. Frank, this question is for you. It says, Ambassador Mora mentioned that the Trump administration is interested in combating transnational organized crime in the region. Is there a way for the Caribbean to persuade the United States government continue helping the Caribbean in illicit firearms trafficking, especially since most of the guns come from the United States? Or is this a non-starter? Asked Bruce. What are some alternatives for the region to combat illicit arms trafficking? And I want to extend this conversation beyond Frank to see if there are any thoughts that Andy and Liz may have on this issue of illicit arms trafficking and what the United States might be able to do and others might be able to do. I want to start with Frank.
Certainly. Thank you for the question. Just a real quick comment on this very interesting discussion that we were having on China. This is a strategic dilemma for the United States and the Caribbean. Because on the other hand, as Liz and Andy were saying, Caribbean is having to look for partners because of the retreat of the United States, right, from its engagements and the reduction in support that it has provided in the past. But it has a political agenda to push back on China. The Caribbean, on the other hand, needs, as I said, these kinds of support and engagement. But the question is, how much is it willing to risk a confrontation with the Caribbean, with the United States? How much leverage now does the United States have? Can the United States inflict further pain on the Caribbean for its rise in engagement with China? These are the strategic questions that I think the United States and the Caribbean have to ask themselves on this issue. Okay, to the question. When I was in the Biden administration, this was an issue that we talked about quite a bit, both bilaterally, but also at multilateral fora such as the OAS. I'm sorry to say that we made very little progress. There were legal cases presented in U.S. courts, U.S. federal courts, in which the Caribbean and Mexico, and I believe one or two others, were plaintiffs in those cases. And we, the United States, pushed back. The Biden administration pushed back on these issues. And so there were some things on the edges that I think we were able to work on, but not in a substantive way. I think in terms of the Trump administration, notwithstanding its focus on transnational criminal organizations and violence, it has shown very little willingness on the issue of arms trafficking or anything. In fact, look at the situation in Mexico, where the attention of the United States is very focused on the so-called cartels there. But at no point in the discussion has the issue of the trafficking of arms north to south ever come up. Although my understanding is that President Sheinbaum did raise that issue with President Trump in one of the conversations they had. But I just simply don't see the political will or the prioritization to make this a bilateral issue, an issue in which the United States can offer some relief, not just because it's the Trump administration, but because our own domestic politics and our domestic laws.
Yeah, great. Thank you much, Frank. Andy, any thoughts?
Yes, I think on this issue, I think Frank is absolutely right. There is a concern, of course, that the Caribbean hasn't been able to do enough to stop the flow of illicit arms into the Caribbean. This is still very much a big issue. I mean, most of the weapons that are coming into the Caribbean countries, causing what they call concatenated violence in places like Trinidad and Tobago, in Guyana, now even in Barbados, of all places. I mean, a lot of this is happening because of guns flowing in from the United States. I think Caribbean leaders are now beginning to have a strategy of what I call public awareness campaigns now to let people realize that most of these weapons are coming from the United States. You have to sort of try to stop, if you can, that flow of weapons to the United States. Now, whether or not the United States is going to be interested in this, I don't think so. But the reality is that there are now educational campaigns being launched to inform the public about the risks associated with illicit arms trafficking, and also to encourage community involvement in reporting suspicious activities, especially on the borders of these countries. I believe that there is already, maybe, Liz might be able to talk more about this. She might have a much better feel of this on the ground, but I believe that there's now a sense of gathering data about arms trafficking in the Caribbean, try to understand the scale of the problem, try to develop a strategy to combat it, because too many people are dying because of arms coming from the United States. It's almost like the drug trafficking situation as well. I mean, a lot of the drugs are coming in to the Caribbean from the United States as well. You get the impression when you hear Donald Trump speak that is the other way around. He said, for example, that there's tons of weapons, drugs coming from Canada, for example, into the United States, and that turned out to be a lie. So we have to be very careful not to buy into the narrative of the U.S. president, who doesn't really care that much about people in the region. He cares more about the monies that can be gleaned from the gun lobbies in the United States for his campaigns and so on. He doesn't care about the people, the human costs of these weapons in the region. So Caribbean states have to take a stand on this issue. And I agree with Frank, they're not doing enough. They should be doing more to try to stop this illicit flow of weapons into the region.
Thank you, Andy. Any thoughts, Liz?
I won't speak specifically on the matter of the status of gun crime, etc. That's not necessarily my forte. I know it's an area of concern naturally to the region. What I will comment on is the support, though, from the government of the United States for actions which can help to counter it. So initially, when the stop orders came out, in our conversations with our colleagues and friends in the Department of Defense, particularly through U.S. Southern Command, which works very closely with us on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, as well as security issues. We had understood up to December that there were conversations around increasing the allocations for supporting programs in the Caribbean, which could counter those types of things, and for HADR. Now, originally they were not to be affected by the cuts. That was the original word we got, and then they were. So right now we're uncertain about a lot of things, including whether some of the key, the large regional exercise trade winds, which usually looks at those exercises for joint exercising between the Caribbean security forces, U.S. security forces, and others who operate in the Caribbean space, French, Dutch, etc., whether those are actually going to go ahead. And I think that maybe that is a reflection of the perspective on the matter. That's all I can say on that. That's all I wish to say.
Okay. Thank you. Before I go to the next question, let me just find and share with you what I couldn't find quickly when I was talking about the China engagement in Guyana. The program under which the loan from United States Export-Import Bank for the gas to energy project has been awarded is called the China and Transformational Exports Program. China and Transformational Exports Program. Targeted strategic engagement to protect American interests. Let me go to the next question. Credit for that question going to Mr. Frank Comito. Here's what he says. The Caribbean, with a population of 45 million people, and he's talking about the circum-Caribbean, collectively is the 5th largest population in Latin America and the Caribbean. The U.S. remains in its most significant part in trade and travel and the mutual benefits that bring. The region also presents value as a third border with the United States. Does that economic and security relationship present opportunity for the Caribbean and mutual benefit to the region and the United States? Question for anyone. Anything, Frank?
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief. Are there opportunities for economic and security cooperation? My initial answer is yes, but I don't know if Washington will take advantage of those opportunities, right? In the economic realm, we all know what the approach of this administration is. It's very transactional. It has a very zero-sum view of trade and trade imbalances. This is still considered a very small market for the United States. And so this administration, in its both disruption and chaos, as well as distraction on other issues, I just don't see them looking at the Caribbean as an opportunity in the economic space. I think perhaps more in the security realm, well, I think the administration has more interest. But I think the focus is very much, as I mentioned in my remarks, when it comes to security in the Western Hemisphere, it's Mexico and Central America, and beyond that, it's just not that significant or important. So, unfortunately, there's always been significant opportunities for cooperation, but I just don't see the political climate, the will for Washington to take advantages of those opportunities.
Okay. Any thoughts, Frank, or Andy or Liz?
I would agree with Frank on this point because I think, we're living in kind of unusual territory here when it comes to the new Trump administration. There is, of course, it would make sense to have opportunities between the U.S. and Caribbean nations with respect to security and economics. We can build a much more robust partnership that addresses economic security challenges within the region. But I don't know if the appetite is there from this Trump administration. The one hope that I hold out is that Trump will not be there forever. There could be a change in government within the next 4 years. Just let's wait and see what happens. I think Caribbean nations should do what the Chinese are doing in the sense that saying, let's wait out this guy. He's not going to be there forever. There could be another administration that comes into office that would be much more, amenable to this kind of economic and security partnership with the Caribbean. I think that's a very, very possible thing. I know he feels that he's a king that will last, forever, but he really is an emperor that has no clothes. And I think in large part, what we're seeing is a lot of bluster, a lot of sort of, what happens when a sort of a big giant is dying. There's a lot of trashing around, and probably a lot of people get affected by that trashing around of the giant dying. I think we're witnessing some of that happening as well in this interregnum, as they call it. So I think we wait and see what happens in the next 4 years. We wait and see whether or not there's a change in the government of the United States that will be much more amenable to this kind of economic and security partnership with the Caribbean states. There's a possibility. But in the meantime, I'm going to go back to what Liz just said. If there's spaces and vacuums, guess what? Somebody's going to fill those spaces. The Chinese are very, very willing to fill those spaces. Canada is very, very willing to fill some of those spaces. There's now a new initiative called the Canada Caribbean Initiative. I know I've always been involved in some of this discussion, but this a serious attempt of Canada to diversify its interests away from the United States. I don't think that's going to change even with a new government in the United States. I think Canada is now becoming very much aware of the fragility of a partnership with the United States, economically, security, and otherwise. So we're already planning. I'm talking now specifically being a Canadian citizen who's from Barbados, but Canadian citizen for the last since 40 years. But I think we in Canada are already thinking about the future in terms of a future that will not have the United States as a hegemonic power, that will not have the United States as a dominant force to be reckoned with. It's still going to be a major power, but it's not going to have the same kind of impact on states like Canada. It wouldn't have the same impact on states in the Caribbean. And China is going to fill those spaces. Canada will fill those spaces. European Union is now thinking about re-energizing partnerships with Caribbean nations. So I think, we might look for a world in the future that doesn't have that strong imprint of the United States on that world, in the next world order that will emerge from this world.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Any thoughts, Liz?
Just say that I think it probably is more related, could potentially more be related to if there are US business interests in the Caribbean and whether those business interests have a voice with the current administration, and whether there's a perspective that the voice of those business interests are aligned with the administration's thinking, and if the business interests, for example, may support financially the administration and they have a big enough voice. I think those are more the things that would influence whatever posture is taken. And I say that thinking about certain types of interests in the Caribbean, for example, on the cruise tourism. Because if you think about the cruise tourism, US has a very big interest in the Caribbean, and they're an important lobbying group. So I think that's really where the conversations are going to sit. And I probably don't have enough information on the depths of those relationships, but I feel that's where influence could potentially lie.
Good. Let me share what will be the last question, and it's a question intended for Frank. And after Frank will have responded to the question, I want to do two things, which I'll tell you about soon. This question is from George Fariol, a colleague of many of ours. Here it is, Frank. Aside from a passing observation about Haiti from Liz Riley, the issue has not appeared in the presentations so far. How is Haiti viewed by Trump 2.0? Aside from immigration and drugs, arms issues, does the United States even care about Haiti? Right?
Well, in fact, George also participated in a call with folks on the Hill on this particular issue, and I've been involved in other discussions as well. The short end is, remember that the administration's approach, orientation towards the Caribbean and towards the hemisphere is not an opportunity-based approach. It is a threat-based approach, a threat-based policy, meaning that threats, what comes mostly from the region are threats, whether it's migrants or violence or things of that nature, China, et cetera, right? And it's not looking for opportunities. It is looking at how to contain and push back on threats. And of course, their view of Haiti is just that this is a source of instability, potential migration, and it's hard to address the complexity and of the issue and the challenge in Haiti. As the discussion that we've been into and that George was participating is there's sort of three policy options that the administration is considering. One is whether to ramp up, but in terms of the support for the police, support for the Kenyan mission, and the diplomatic political effort, which has been quite complicated, as we all know, and challenging. Second is to kind of do a muddling through version of just try to contain as much as you can, but not make major political or financial investments. And the third option, which is the one I think I'm hearing and seeing more often, is a kind of let's pull back option. And let's try to find a way of just containing outside of Haiti the potential threats that particularly migration, that might come from. I don't have confirmation of this, but it does seem that increasingly the administration is moving towards the third option, which is to pull back gradually and kind of surround the island, if you will, with capacities that would prevent migration or other things from coming out of that of that country, and not make the kind of significant investments in time, political security assistance that is required to address the issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. I want to do two things before I turn it back to Tony for final remarks. The first of which is to ask, beginning with Liz and then Andy and then Frank, take a minute to offer any final comments, observations, remarks you want. After which I'll make a few observations, then I'll turn it over to Tony. So beginning with you, Liz, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just to say that on the disaster risk management front, the government of the United States has been an important partner, but they're certainly not the only partner. And I think that the region has built a breadth of friendships and relationships that continue to support us. And I think we can also engage new partners who can support us. And this will continue to be a critical issue for the Caribbean. It's a critical development and security issue. And my perspective is that we need to make the most of the situation and ensure that the Caribbean comes out stronger and better positioned to rely on ourselves better to address what is going to continue to be a developmental challenge for us.
Great. Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I think in closing for me, I want to remind people that small states can punch above their weight at the international level. We've seen it happen before. Small states are normal entrepreneurs. Many of the issues that you see being discussed within multilateral fora, sometimes initiated by small states. Look at the role that Mia Montley has played, for example, internationally. She's able to articulate the challenges of small states in the region, because the challenge, for example, of climate change is that it is an existential issue for Caribbean states. These are states that may not be around if we don't deal with the climate problem. So I think we need to have a sense of agency in the Caribbean and realize that even although we're small states, we can actually punch above our weight. We can actually be a little bit more assertive in our positioning with respect, even to the United States, the big bully these days. We can be a little bit more assertive and not bow down to the king. I think that's the attitude that Caribbean states have to take in dealing with Trump 2.0. And I know it's a bit of a challenge because many leaders in the Caribbean may not think that they are able to withstand an onslaught from President Trump if he wanted to really do damage to the region. But you have to remember that there are other people within the international community that be willing to rally around small states. There's OASIS, there is the number of alliances of small island states around the globe that can actually play a much bigger role in multilateral engagement. And I hope that Caribbean leaders think about that, remain normal entrepreneurs, keep pushing the things that matter for Caribbean states.
The question of normal entrepreneurs, Andy, I immediately thought of the role of President A.N.R. Robinson of Trinidad in the establishment of what is now the International Criminal Court. Small state leader, big idea, let's do it. It was done. Final words, Frank?
But I was, during the discussion, I was writing the key words of the discussion. What words were said most often during our discussion? And I identified three. One was disruption. Two was uncertainty. And the third was alternative partnerships or self-reliance. Those are the three sort of themes that keep coming up. There were others, but there were three themes that keep coming up. This is the context in which the Caribbean and much of the world finds itself as the United States retreats and bullies all at the same time. And I couldn't agree more with Andy with the point of, and we're seeing in Europe, how Europe is now saying to itself, we can no longer rely on the United States for our security and defense and our economic well-being. We must look to ourselves. We must build our own defense industries. We have to make our own arrangements because we're moving into a very different world. And the Caribbean, smaller states, of course, but they have no choice but to do the same, to see greater cohesion, greater cooperation among member states of the Caribbean, and speak with one voice when they're engaging the rest of the world as they try to navigate these testy waters of disruption, uncertainty, and the retreat of US leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think everyone who's participating in this webinar would agree with me that this has been an excellent reflection on trials and opportunities, trials and tribulations, disruptions, one kind or another. And I want to thank the people who will have been part of enabling this to happen. First of all, the panelists, Frank and Andy and Liz and Tony. But this could not have been organized without the work of people like Claudia and Carlos and the support team at LACC, and I want to thank them as well. But finally, thank the audience who will have joined, registered, joined, and stayed the duration of our engagement. I want to thank you all for making this 90, 94, 95 minutes worth your while. Well, before I turn it over to Tony, I want to share with you words of wisdom or words of observation of another gentleman, this time a writer. First paragraph of the first chapter, A Tale of Two Cities. It's a long sentence, but I crave your indulgence. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or evil, in the superlative degree of comparison holy. Words penned more than 100 years ago by Charles Dickens. The best of times, the worst of times. I think we're seeing a manifestation of what Charles Dickens wrote, that classic Tale of Two Cities. Over to you, Tony.
That's a great note to end on, Ivala. Wonderful book. I just wanted to say thank you as well, join you in thanking the everyone involved. For me, what's been fascinating about the discussion is that a lot of the focus of analysis nowadays is on the erosion of the multilateral order that we knew. But I think what I've gained from the participation of you in the panel is that at the same time, there is a new multilateralism emerging. That's Frank's third key word, alternative partnerships. And I think that's a fascinating aspect of the current turmoil globally, that everybody is thinking, okay, how can we be more cohesive in our region? And then how can we find reliable partners? That search is not going to end. So I'm looking forward to another event with CPC sometime in the future where we scan the horizon at a slightly different point in time and see how that is going. But I think that's what everyone is being forced to do. And it's going to make for some fascinating new partnerships, some fascinating new activities. And I think that's the flip side that we sometimes ignore by only looking at what's where multilateralism is breaking down as a result of Trump 2.0. So thanks to everyone.
Thank you. Claudia, shall we take a shot before we all leave?
Yes. You mean a photo of the group?
Right.
Sure. Carlos, is it possible for you to do that?
Yes, I'll go ahead and put you in gallery mode and I'll take a screenshot.
Thanks so much.
Wonderful.
I'm so sorry. I have the captions in front of the picture. Let me move these out of the way and just give 1 second and perfect. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.